would call Capernaum. The water lapped against the boats in lazy waves, a calm, unobtrusive rhythm, as if the sea itself were drawing breath. The wind, warm and salty, brushed over the surface, rippling the crests of the waves, carrying the smell of seaweed, scales, and wet wood into the land, mixing it with the sharpness of the evaporating nets, with the metallic tang of blood from worked hands and the fish that had warped into fine grooves between wooden planks. Men stood on the shore. Some knelt in the shallow surf, washing their nets with cracked hands while the water flowed cold over their fingers. Others sat on overturned baskets, scraping their fingers over their rough, cracked palms. Traces of a life marked by hard work, by relentless repetition. I was one of them, one among many. A man whose activities were limited to the same as those of his fathers and their fathers before them. One whose days passed on the shore and on the lake, whose hands reached for ropes and wood, for fish and nets, for everything that lay between the hours, and whose name mattered not. This was Yam Ginosar, the shining sea. At dawn, it promised riches, enticing with silvery glittering water, peaceful reflections, and the first light of the sun. But at midday, when the heat burned on the planks, when the reeds stood still as if holding their breath, it became motionless, a glittering surface beneath which only shadows moved. Shadows that could not be grasped, and suggested that the day had slowly come to an end. On this day, the nets were not very productive. The biny, heavy fish with strong, muscular bodies had become rare. We had only caught one, a twisted, writhing mass, its tail beating against the planks and its gills gasping for air. They were fish of the deep, denizens of the mud and darkness, hard to catch, full of strength that never faltered even in their death throes. And then there were the mushed, the quiet fish, flat and broad, with scales that shimmered dully as they died, with holding eyes. The mother fish, as we called them, because they carried their young in their mouths as a mouth brooder. They didn't fight like the binnies. They gave in, moved with the current. In the background, on the shore, a throng of people was assembling, which initially made itself heard as a murmur of voices, then as the slow undulation of the crowd. Men and women, fishermen and traders, the curious pressed closer, attracted by something that could not be grasped, but hung heavy in the air, like the salt that remained after hours at sea. And then I saw him. He was standing not far away on the dry shore, his robe simple, the hem dusted with the paths he had traveled. The sun was low behind him, a shimmering light that dissolved the edges of his form, rendering him almost something short of unreal, as if he were just a part of the heat, a mirage that could blow away with the wind at any moment. His voice carried across the water, clear and firm, unhurried, as if he had suspended time within himself. "They see," he declared, his voice weighted with sorrow, his gaze piercing through the masses. "But they do not recognize." The words rang out, sharp and unrelenting, carried by the wind like an accusation, like a plea. His chest rose with the weight of his burden, his breath heavy with the grief of a man who knew truth, yet watched it slip through fingers like sand. He stepped forward, his robes billowing, his arms spread wide as if grasping for the souls before him. His voice deepened, thick with lament, with urgency. "They hear!" he bellowed, the sound striking like a hammer against stone. "But they do not understand." The air hangs oppressively, bearing a faint metallic tang that clings to the back of my throat. Each breath feels sharp and lingering, stirring up a haunting reminder of odd, experimental tonics. This sterile aura, devoid of the rawness and natural human touch, suffocates. Only a cold emptiness settling heavily in the lungs, as though time itself has stalled, unmoving. Sounds, hushed and distant, drift along the corridor's edges, pressing in on all sides. Pale light trickles through dull windows, bathing the walls in a wan, listless glow, neither inviting nor entirely forbidding, just caught somewhere between longing and silence. I swallow. My fingers twitch, uncertain whether to reach out or recoil. The weight in my chest grows, pressing, as if something unseen lingers just beyond the dim glow. I shudder. A subtle tension hangs in the air, carrying the weight of unresolved thoughts. Footsteps, echoing and near ethereal, seemed to travel corridors I could not fully see. Uncertainty coils in my chest, the echoes weaving a faint sense of pressure around me. Now and then, a voice would drone, calling out names as though reading from some ledger, each syllable tossed about like coins worn smooth with age. A quiet weariness settles in, yet I feel a thread of determination pulling me forward. Next to him, a twinkling machine that sounded a curious ticking rose and fell in a methodical pace. The relentless rhythm brings a prickling discomfort, a reminder that time, though mechanical, demands reckoning. I watched the slow rise and fall of his chest under a thin sheet, pondering how a world could be so cleansed of the tangles and burdens I once knew, the grit of old labor and the countless debts paid in blood and stone for the edifices of our gods. A tired resolve grips me. The memory of that old world presses upon my conscience, yet I remain rooted by a sense of duty that refuses to yield. An undercurrent of quiet apprehension underscores every detail. Where once there were raw edges, unforgiving corners, and harsh shapes, here all had been molded into precise lines, guided by the hum of machines I recognized only in some distant recollection. A faint unease settles in. My gaze, wandering over these rigid contours. There was no gentle drift of time. It marched forward on a mechanical beat, dispelling the mystery of any passing hour. A subtle pressure tightens around my thoughts, as if each moment threatens to slip away before I can catch it. Still, I sensed that hidden beneath this enamel of progress lay a realm of obscurity, the last pocket of uncharted air that might keep us from losing ourselves to a polished delirium. Reluctant determination flickers in my chest, an awareness that beneath these walls, beyond the towering monolithic monstrosities visible through the gleaming long window, stretching across this glossy-like varnished pale room, lurks an unsettling void. I stood in the midst of it, fingers clenched around the rail of a bed, an odd anchor in this place beyond my reckoning. Though discomfort gnaws at me, I hold fast and resolute. In some hazy corner of thought, I became aware that the past was stirring as though I had glimpsed these surroundings once before. The notion was both distant and oddly comforting, and yet it flickered away before I could name it. I simply stood, transfixed by the odd recollection that wouldn't shake from my memories, waiting for me to awaken. But from what? Confused, I found myself continuing recalling, drowning into some past. Back at the lake, I didn't know if he saw me. We, the fishermen, stood at the edge of the crowd, our hands rough with salt and toil, our bodies lulled by the sea's eternal pull. The sun was dipping lower, casting everything in gold, and we let the rhythm of the waves and the hauling of the nets settle into our bones, signaling the quiet approach of the day's end. We had no reason to be drawn in, no reason to care. Yet something about the way he stood there, higher up on the drier sand, caught my eye. He was separated from them. The dust curled around his feet with every step he took, puny traces of the earth rising and disappearing before they could sit down. The wind carried his voice over the heads of the crowd, and yet, somehow, it reached us as if he had spoken our names. It took me a very long effort and time to realize, standing on the threshold of clarity, but never quite crossing over. He might have been one of us. From a simple vantage, the sea seemed endless. It stretched beyond sight, an unbroken line where the sky folded into water. Yet I couldn't help but wonder, did we truly set out each morning from the shore with our nets? Or had we been standing there all along waiting? If all we ever hold is this moment, this breath, this fragile interval between seeing, knowing, and kindling that light of discovery, how many times can a man cast himself into the unknown before it becomes the very place he has always belonged? Have we reached our destination upon arrival, or were we already there before we ever set out? And if our existence is bound to this single moment, when do we step beyond the threshold where arrival is no longer a point ahead, but something that has always been within, caught in an endless state of becoming, never truly arriving? The rhythmic ticking of the machine pulled me back. His face lay still, his breath steady, rising and falling in measured cadence. I exhaled, pressing my palm against the cold iron of the bed frame, grounding myself in the present, if such a thing could be grasped. Yet the question lingered, as it had in days long past, as it always would.